15 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few wide receivers I would start this week. The first guy, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. So Waddle, he's been having a great rookie season and second best wide receiver this year in the rookie class, behind Jamar Chase, who's having a monster year and one of the best fantasy receivers this season. So Waddle, the last few weeks, he's really picked it up and had some huge fantasy days. Week 11 at the Jets, 1 carry, 1 yard, a rushing touchdown, 8 catches, 65 yards. Week 12 versus Carolina, 9 catches, 137 yards, a touchdown. And Week 13 versus the Giants, 9 catches, 90 yards. So right here, once again, he versus the Jets here in Week 15. I know the Jets versus wide receivers have been pretty decent this season, giving up the 7th least amount of fantasy points, which is hard to believe in my opinion. The Jets, a lot of teams go up and down the field versus them. A lot of teams put up big numbers in points. And right here, that's just surprising. But anyway, Jalen Waddle, I think he has another good game. And going back to Week 11, like I mentioned, he had 20 fantasy points in PPR leagues versus the Jets. And it wouldn't surprise me if he could hit that number once again this week. The next wide receiver is Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers. So Brandon Aiyuk, he was a bust for about the first 8 to 10 weeks of the season here. But the last few weeks now, he's picked it up and he's putting up numbers like everyone expected he would when they drafted him coming into the fantasy football season. Week 12 versus Minnesota, 1 carry, 4 yards, 3 catches, 91 yards. Week 13 at Seattle, 3 catches, 55 yards. And Week 14 at Cincinnati, 1 carry, 4 yards, 6 catches, 62 yards, and a touchdown. So right here in Week 15, he's got a very plus matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons that give up the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. So Aiyuk, we know he's a playmaker. We know he goes out there. He could run the routes. He's an athletic receiver, no doubt about it. Just about consistency and making plays. In the last few weeks, he's been doing that. So as a flex option or a number 2 wide receiver, what a great matchup, like I mentioned, versus the Falcons. I think he's a decent start this week. The next guy's Amari Cooper of the Dallas Cowboys. So Cooper, he came back over the last few weeks here, and he's been playing good football here, is Amari. And Amari, when he's healthy and right, this guy's still a top 10 receiver in the league, in my opinion. So the last 2 weeks since he returned, Week 13 in New Orleans, in a limited role, they got his feet wet, 2 catches, 41 yards. And then last week at Washington, 5 catches, 51 yards, and a touchdown. So right here, great matchup on paper at the New York Giants, who don't stop anyone on defense and give up the 7th most fantasy points to receivers on the season. So I think Cooper in this one could get 70 or 80 yards and find the end zone. And he's another wide receiver with a great track record versus the New York Giants. In the 4 seasons he's been with the Dallas Cowboys. The next wide receiver is Hunter Renfrow of the Las Vegas Raiders. So Hunter Renfrow's been a PPR machine this season. And last week was the best game of his NFL career, was Renfrow. 13 catches, 117 yards, a touchdown, a fumble loss on 14 targets. So right here, Derek Carr loves him, no doubt about it. And this guy, he can run all the routes. He has DBs losing them in the shuffle and cutting guys up in that secondary. So this week here on paper, not a great matchup at Cleveland, but it's a ball game where it's going to be a game, in my opinion, where Vegas, their only chance of winning is throwing the football, because that front 4 is vicious, and this O-line for the Raiders isn't that great this season. So they're going to have trouble running the football with Josh Jacobs, I say here. And they're going to have to throw a lot like they did last week versus Kansas City. So I think Renfrow has another good PPR game, probably 7 catches, 8 catches, I would say, 80, 90 yards. And that's a big ball game for PPR owners, anywhere from 16 to 20 fantasy points. And like I mentioned, he's the number 1 target as a wide receiver right now for this Raider team. And especially if Wall is out again, he's going to be peppered with targets this week. And the 5th and final wide receiver I would start this week is Chase Claypool of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Claypool, he's been a bust for most of the season here, but the last few weeks, he's stepped his game up and he's putting up pretty decent numbers now, is Claypool for PPR owners. Week 12 at Cincy, 3 catches, 83 yards. Week 13 versus Baltimore, 2 catches, 52 yards, and 2 rushing yards. And then last week in Minnesota, 8 catches, 93 yards, and a carry for 2 yards. So right here, Week 15, another plus matchup versus Tennessee that gives up the 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers. And I could see this ball game with the Steelers and Titans be a mini type of shootout between these teams here. Obviously, Ben Roethlisberger's best days are done, but he still tries to hit Claypool on that deep ball. And it wouldn't surprise me in this one if Claypool does get behind that leaky secondary over there in Tennessee, and possibly has a couple big plays in this one. And right here, this guy's a playmaker. We know what he's capable of. We saw last season in his rookie year with Pittsburgh putting up big numbers. And I think this week here, he's a solid number 2 wide receiver to start. So that's a few wide receivers I would start here week 15 of the fantasy football season.